Hi, this is Sally Thorne from the UBC School of Nursing. I'm on faculty here, and I'm delighted to be part of the UBC Nursing Research Toolbox series and to have the opportunity to talk to you about one of my favorite topics, the art and science of getting published. Now, getting published is something that all of my faculty colleagues take very seriously and are really enthusiastic about, and there's a lot of knowledge and skill among the faculty, across the faculty, about how to do this. So I'm going to be talking a little bit generally today to give some general tips, but I want to say from the outset, you're in a school that has a tremendous amount of talent and a lot of scholarly generosity to try and help you out on a more individualized basis as well. So my particular credential with regard to giving this talk is that I have actually played quite an active role in the world of journal editing and being on the receiving end of manuscripts and on the receiving end of editorial reviews. So I bring that particular lens to the conversation. For the past 3.5 years, I've been the editor-in-chief of the journal Nursing Inquiry, and for about 10 years I've been section editor for the journal Qualitative Health Research, which are journals that our colleagues quite often publish in. I've also had active roles in other journals as well. So I have been quite involved in the academic publishing community, and it's my privilege to be able to take some of the insights that I've gained from those experiences and bring them back to share with my colleagues and our students here. Where I'd like to begin today is with the idea of getting started. Any nurse can certainly publish, and many nurses right off the bat, even before they've finished their undergraduate degree, have found a way to become published in some way, shape, or form. But the particular kind that I'm talking about today is going to be writing for a scholarly publication. And the key to beginning this is really thinking about your readiness to write in that particular way. You may have finished a term paper and been really excited about what you were writing about. You maybe have got a really good grade and good feedback from your professor. But the part that you'll have to think about beyond that is whether you really are fully familiar with the current state of the science as it exists in that particular field, to the extent that you would need to be able to understand whether what you can contribute would actually be an original angle of thinking. And part of the reason for this scrutiny at this very early stage is that publications are the kind of thing that actually always stay on your record permanently. They're part of your CV and they're part of your record. And you really do want to be sure that everything that you publish in a scholarly journal is something that's going to stand the test of time and that you're going to be proud of going forward. So the very first part is to really think about whether you do have something important to write about and whether you have the capacity and the knowledge at this stage in your career to write about it in a way that's going to move the science forward. Now, assuming that you've come up with the answer yes, and you can certainly consult with your colleagues and faculty members around that question, they may encourage you. Once you've come up with the feeling that you can write something, you've got something to say, there's a whole series of steps that you'll want to take into consideration.
And one of the first that I really do encourage is to think about selecting a journal. Sometimes people think about writing a paper and then wondering if it'll fit into a journal. And I do think it's well worth thinking about that at an earlier stage. Not to say that that's necessarily the only place you might send it, but it allows you to crystallize your thinking around a particular audience at an early point in the process. All journals, when you check their websites, will have aims and scope. And that's journal language for saying, what kind of a conversation do we think we're in? Are we a journal that has to do with oncology nurse clinicians that are talking to other nurse clinicians, and that's our primary audience? Are we a general journal that's speaking to all ideas in nursing? Are we a journal that's actually addressing social scientists? And that those aims and scope will give you an idea of the topic, but also the expectations of who the readers are. Are they clinicians? Are they people with graduate degrees? Are they people who are hardcore scholars? And the style of writing, of course, will be quite different depending on who you think the audience would be. Another important issue with the journal that you choose is a question of credibility. And I'm not going to say a lot about this at this point. You'll have the web link in the handouts. But just to alert you that there are increasing number of journals, especially the ones that might send you an email saying please submit your paper to us. We're guaranteed to publish it in only 3 days. Those kinds of non-credible journals are increasingly out there, and increasingly they are disguising themselves as credible journals. So there are steps to be taken if you're not entirely sure, if it's not a standard journal that you're very familiar with, as to whether the journal you're aiming for is actually credible. And I will do another podcast on that, and we'll try and post that on the graduate website here. Sometimes people also select a journal for its impact factor. And the impact factor is a mathematical calculation of the frequency with which all of the papers in that particular journal are cited by other authors over a 2-year period prior to the year of publication. So it's somewhat arbitrary. It's a fixed period of time within a fairly short window after publication. And it creates a number. So all of the credible journals who have been gathering data and made an application to be considered for an impact factor will have such a thing. But out of about 500 nursing journals that exist at the moment, for example, no more than about 110 actually have an impact factor. So it is the more established journals, the ones that have the wherewithal to put together the data to make an application to be considered, and it takes several years to gather that data. So just because it doesn't have an impact factor doesn't mean it's not credible. It might be a small nursing society journal, for example, very credible, but not one that's put forward the application. In the research world, if you are attempting to get CIHR funding for your studies, for example, if you're trying to get a job in an academic setting, you might care deeply about the impact factor. You might want to look among journals to see which ones have the higher ratings, because those are journals that will have often a more rigorous peer review process. And if you're able to get a publication in a high impact journal, that might speak louder on your resume than will one that doesn't have the high impact. And that may not matter to you if you're writing a clinical paper and you're interested in a particular audience, but it could if you're looking for funding, for example. And the other final thing about a journal, when you pick it, at the very early stage, it's really good to always have the plan B, especially for newer writers and people who are not yet experienced in the art of writing for publication. Most of us are very used to getting rejections. Even seasoned writers like Dr. Wendy Hall and myself and others will very often find that a journal doesn't like our wonderful work and sends it back. So when you're a newer writer, that can really hit to the heart, and we've all seen graduate students and others submit their first paper, not be successful, and just feel, oh, clearly I'm not meant to be a writer. It's easy to lose your confidence. So always in advance of sending any paper, make sure you've got plan B. If they don't like it, silly them, there's got to be some other journal you're going to try next. Next issue is finding a voice. When you've figured out the journal you want to send it to, it's really a good idea to read papers from that journal, to become familiar with the style and the approach that journal likes to use in communication. It's a little bit like each journal being conversation. And you lurk a little bit to listen, to sort of say, what kinds of language are they choosing? Are they very highly sophisticated, intellectual, dense, professional language? Or are they being accessible language to speak to people who may not have graduate degrees, for example? Is it using jargon language? Does it have lots of numbers? Is it soft and feely? How long are the papers? So all of these issues help you understand the conversation that you're trying to enter, and to think about whether you can express your ideas in the voice that goes along with the culture of a particular journal. Another issue is positioning yourself as yourself. So if you're not somebody who has 30 years of experience in the field and you've read everything there is and been studying it for a long time, if you're newer at it, you don't want to position yourself as the world's expert on the thing. You can position yourself as somebody who's inquiring, who's learning, who's engaging, who's come up with certain ideas. And sometimes that's the subtle way in which you express yourself, to say, I developed a curiosity for this, rather than, this is the way the world is. So thinking about who you are, and there's no shame in being early in the publishing world. Everybody has to start somewhere. So making sure you position yourself as yourself, and you're speaking from a voice that's you as well. And the next issue I want to talk about was considering authorship and ownership. There are important international rules on what kind of involvement that you ought to have in a written form if you want to be listed as an author. And I say this because so often we work in teams and groups, and you may be doing group projects, for example, in your programs, there are specific rules with regard to the level of engagement in the thinking, the generation of the idea, the articulation of the ideas in writing, and having read and commented on all drafts that are required in order for somebody to be named as an author. So you can violate it by naming somebody, just to be nice, adding them into your author list when they didn't actually participate. That's not okay. And also you can sometimes exclude somebody who ought to have been involved because of the level of engagement that they had. And this can become quite tricky when it's, for example, your master's thesis. Because on the one hand, it's yours and it's yours alone and it's your wonderful piece of work. On the other hand, there were probably some other people who had some involvement in it, particularly your supervisor and perhaps also your committee members. And so these are issues to negotiate. They're always issues to raise. Where somebody has participated in such a way as to be worthy of authorship, then they ought to be named, and where they haven't, they shouldn't be. You can imagine that becomes tricky where you have a supervisory committee that might have a supervisor who is closely working with you, maybe two other committee members, one of whom hardly read it, the other of whom was actively engaged and giving you lots of input. So you can start to see the equity issues. These are really good conversations to have at an early point with your supervisor and to make sure that you have some clarity. It's also a really good point if you're working with a team to make sure you don't in advance make commitments. There are three of us working together, we'll all be co-authors on this paper. And then if one disappears and actually doesn't contribute to it, you're kind of stuck. So always make sure the conversation is about the rules and the expectations, and then you don't make decisions until you actually see how things work. On my own research teams, I invariably begin teamwork with these conversations and explaining who's paper boss on any paper, like who's going to be the final decider on who's in and who's out. And using humor helps a lot. Using humor, but also clarity to say this is how we're going to sort it out. So it's no favor to include somebody that wasn't actively involved. And similarly, if there are people who were involved but perhaps not involved at the level of authorship, then they might be listed in the acknowledgement. And that's a perfectly appropriate thing to do. However, you don't acknowledge somebody without their permission. It just might be they don't want to be acknowledged, or you had a difference of opinion with them because they didn't work very well with you and they prefer not to be listed in that way. So it's a little bit political, but it's a thing to be aware of. Okay. Important to figure out the article type. If it's a research study, write it as a research study, but if it's a clinical practice paper, that you can't organize it according to a research study. So you have to be able to align what it is that you want to do with the structure, and many journals will actually only give you so many options. They'll say it's either got a research study or a discussion paper or a review, and you need to, this is part of the issue of aligning with the journal, is to fit yourself into what it is that the journal will allow. But it's always a good idea in that journal to look at some examples and say, okay, I'm writing a commentary, and what do they think a commentary is? Is it 500 words or is it 4,000 words? And what kinds of topics do they use? How do they structure and organize them? If I look at the recent editions of that journal and look at some examples, that'll help me get a sense of what I'm doing and a visual sense of how to organize and structure it in advance. But it's amazing how often people don't quite know whether they're writing a research paper or a discussion paper. It starts off as research and it sort of devolves into discussion, and that's quite an important piece of the whole. It's important to map out and draft what it is you're going to do. Any journal has a limit. Almost all of them have a word limit, no more than 5,000 words or something like that. Be really aware of it, and they probably mean it. Some of them will use the word normally, and that means they will allow you to have a little wiggle room on that, but if the word normally is not there, they may mean you go to 5,001 words and they send it back. So pay attention to that. And that will require that you actually organize your thinking so that when you're writing out the paper, it's only 5,000 words, you don't want to spend 3,000 on the introduction and then try and squeeze in everything else. So you can use that as a rough guide to figuring out how much detail and how much depth you're going to be able to get into. And structuring your argument. Where are you going to begin? What are the steps you're going to have to talk about it, and where are you going to end? Being able to create that clarity. And these old-fashioned things that you might remember from your grade school composition class, most people sort of put it away after that time. But it is not a bad idea to find some organizing structure into which to put this. What is the main idea I'm going for? Where do I want to end up in this paper? Where am I beginning? And what are the pieces I need to include in what depth and what sequence in order to get there? So I very much encourage that kind of structure of some kind, just to create that map for yourself before you begin. Another issue with publishing is to make sure you align this paper that you're writing with other manuscripts and other things that you might want to write. A challenge that has occurred for many, we've been talking earlier today about the dissertation by paper, can create a real difficulty, because if it's an early in your thesis or dissertation experience and you want to write some of it in a written paper, it becomes very difficult to unthink that in the normal developmental process of a thesis, because it's a learning experience. So if you too early lay down, this is the way the world is, you almost prevent yourself from actually allowing yourself to rethink it and say, boy, now I'm glad I got past that. Once you publish something, it stays published, it doesn't get unpublished. And so sometimes thinking about the timing and sequencing to say, I think this piece of analysis I've done about the literature is really great. I'm going to hold off on publishing it because I do want to allow myself the possibility that as I explore further and develop some understanding in depth, that might actually hold me back and embarrass me. There are very strict rules about self-plagiarizing and overlap. So if you've got two papers they may seem totally different to you, but if they actually sound pretty similar to a reader, that's going to create the impression that you're slicing the ideas a little bit too thin. That's what we mean by salami slicing. Or that if you're finding yourself repeating ideas in multiple publications, you have to be awfully careful that you're not repeating the words. Most journals nowadays do have some kind of system, like Turnitin we have in our program here, for looking for originality. So it's not just that whether you plagiarize something from the available literature, but whether you've written about the same idea multiple times yourself. And it is astounding how often people, in their eagerness to have multiple publications, in their misguided sense that that's going to be a good thing for them to get 3 papers out of this dissertation instead of just 1, for example, that they write too many papers that are too similar. And of course that always stays as part of your record. It's always on your resume, it's always searchable, and so for the rest of your career, people can look at that and say, actually, there's not much justification. This is pretty similar to this other paper. So although it always seems tempting to try and write more, do have some reflection. It's not a wrong thing to write multiple papers about a similar idea, but you want to make sure you're really clear about how you build and link the argument. So if you have written before, you might want to cite and reference that. In an earlier paper, I laid the foundation for this particular issue by developing these arguments. In this paper, I'm now taking this into some other direction. So you've been really overt and clear about a linkage between the two and self-referenced. And avoiding preempting your own work is the mistake that sometimes people make when they're so eager in a thesis or dissertation project, so eager to write something early on, something so general about their topic while they're developing the idea. And sometimes they can write a kind of half-baked version of something that really, had they waited till they've got their findings, can be written with some nuance and some texture, so really make a difference. Problem is, if you publish it in a superficial form, it becomes very difficult to justify what the second one is, and you may find that you're dealing with this limitation on your record, because you have to acknowledge that you can't say, last year I thought this was a good idea, now I think it's a dumb idea. Actually, it's much more complicated than that. So you really create a little bit of a limitation to yourself if you preempt your own work. And these are just some of the hazards to keep in mind. What you know about writing is nobody gets born an academic writer. Even those who are lucky enough to find it easier than others, it's hard work and requires writing and rewriting. It requires developing your own style. You may have a colleague who writes in a particular way, in a particular voice, and you can't fake it if you try. You're trying to find your own way. You can learn a lot by the people you read and the ones you say, I really like reading this particular author because they're clear and articulate and I can see the arguments as they develop. I can see how one idea links to the next. This other one's really dense and it's hard to read. I'm not going to copy that particular style. So try and figure out how to move toward, in all of the things that you write in your programs, how to move toward a place where you're developing your own authentic voice. Sometimes in a graduate degree, people make the mistake of trying to sound too academic and build in too much fancy language, all the big words and things, all the complex sentences, backwards convoluted sentence structure, and actually creating clarity and being as clear and precise and specific and making those linkages as clear as you can doesn't go wrong. And then you can add the little fancy flourishes afterward, but developing, really perfecting the art of writing with clarity so that an idea is apparent and easily accessible to the reader. It's a good idea to capitalize on both immersion in your writing and distance. There's some aspects of writing that you can't do in 10 minutes at a time. Half an hour, an hour. You really have to have those times when you just sit with it and immerse yourself in it and force yourself to sit there on that computer or on that chair and just wrestle with those ideas. And there's other times when forcing yourself to stay there is just like spinning your wheels and making you feel exhausted and miserable. And that may be the time when you need to take some distance from it and say, I'm going for a walk in the woods, I'm taking a shower, I'm going to a movie, whatever. I'm going to leave myself in my mind with what was that writing problem. I'm going to make notes and say, when I get back to this, I really have to figure out whether to write more about this or to go in this direction. Make a little guidance note for yourself, but then you let yourself forget it and trust that your brain is going to gel and percolate some of that when you go off doing something else. And often you'll be amazed when you allow yourself to come back rested, refreshed, come back into your guidance. Now, okay, now I can see how to do it. I was struggling with that before. So try and learn your own style, because we're all different, and figure out when you should force yourself to immerse, when you should create the conditions under which you can, and then when you need to pull back. Copy editing, most people hate it. It's like worse than death to just force yourself word by word and sentence by sentence to look very carefully at what you wrote. You all know what you meant, but in a copy editing, you're now looking at it with the critical eye that says, what did this ridiculous person who wrote this, yourself, right? What did this person actually mean? So you're going with a critical eye, looking for all the places where something could be misinterpreted, all the common errors, all the repetitions, and they're really hard to find. They really do require you go looking at things very, very closely. And as you develop your skills on reflecting on your writing, one of the great gifts that your professors give you when they give you feedback on a paper, they give you things to put on your copy editing list. So they'll say, you overuse the passive voice. Great, I'm going to put that on my list. You're anthropomorphizing. Great, putting that. Unclear reference, put that on my list. And now I've got a list, and with each of those habit patterns that you have, you can go back over your work and say, I'm going to look for every passive voice and see if it was necessary. See if I should change that. And that technique actually is the best way. It's so painful and so gruesome to go that slowly through your written work that it really does train you to self-correct as you write. But it doesn't come magically without actually going through that hard groundwork. So know your own common errors. Don't rely on spell check. It'll only tell you some things. Everybody has another set of things that you always spell wrong or something you always do. Create that list for yourself, and you'll be amazed that the hard work of copy editing is the very best way to strengthen your writing. Referencing. You all reference in all your scholarly papers. And when you're referencing for publication, it's really important to know what it is you're referencing. So it's not simply that somebody said a particular thing or said an idea, but who was it that said that, and why did they say that? So to simply, you can all go through the literature and pull out a sentence or a phrase from someone and and say so-and-so said something. That's easy to do. But an understanding of why they said it, what they were meaning us to understand, and in what context they said that. It's useful to know who you're citing. So is this person a credible authority or not? Somebody like Hitler could have said some very intelligent things, but if you cite Hitler as your authority, it's going to cause people to wonder what on earth is the message. You see what I mean? I'm using an extreme example to demonstrate that the source of an idea is sometimes as important as the idea itself. And if you miss the context in which they're understanding it, your readers may actually know that context and say, what on earth are they pulling on a phenomenologist to justify a grounded theory idea? So be aware of those sources. Also, I know many of you are concerned about the idea of plagiarizing, and so you're sort of extra ultra careful about citing everything. But try and develop the skill of assessing what needs citation and what doesn't. What kinds of ideas are general and easily understandable. And yes, somebody may have said it in the literature, but it may be kind of common knowledge. So you don't need to cite that. And if you're going to cite it, you might cite a particular source for a particular reason. And then which are the ideas that are unique and particular to a certain author that you would want to cite them in relation to that author. Finally, formatting the references. Every journal has its own referencing style. Some of them, if you're using a program like EndNote or ReferenceWorks, will have a format in that system. Don't trust them implicitly because they may not be 100% accurate, but they all have examples and they all have rules. Do pay attention because it's amazing how many people demonstrate a sloppiness when they submit a manuscript and they haven't got it in APA format and the journal uses Harvard style, for example. So do pay attention to that. It conveys the impression that you are being careful and meticulous. And although it may seem petty, people are very much more likely to be favorably inclined toward a paper that looks as if you put that extra thought and attention before you push the submit button than one that looks like you just dashed it all off, or it looks like it was written in the style for another journal. So you just had a rejection somewhere else and you're mad and you're not willing to even look at it, you just sent it off again. And that just creates a subliminal impression in the minds of editors and reviewers that you don't really care. So it reduces your chances of success. Using reflection and guidance. As I've said, you copy edit your own work, you proofread, and then you proofread it again. Keep reading it multiple times. And then instead of choosing friends to have a look at your manuscript to say, they're going to say, I think I know what you mean, or it's sort of okay, you want your critical friends, your very best friends and colleagues, and they may be, classmates and others. Your very best friends and colleagues are the ones you can trust to say, in this particular sentence, I don't think the reader's going to understand what you're getting at, or the link isn't clear between this and this. So you want that critical eye. That's the very best friends that you have. And invite them. Let them know that you've got a thick skin. You're not going to fall apart if they raise those ideas, because that's a gift to you to have that information before you send it in for publication. Read your work as if you're your own worst critic. Turn on yourself and say, I'm going to catch every error here. And learn how to know when you're ready to submit. Some people will find that they're so tired of the paper and so eager to get something into consideration that they'll push that submit button far too quickly, and there's still glitches and errors and things like that. Other people can get themselves so over anxious that they hesitate and find it difficult to push submit. Figure out what kind of person you are and pull yourself back to the middle to some kind of reasonable place where you've done enough work to have attended to most of the issues, but you're willing to send it forward. Now, in the submission process itself, most journals now have an online system, and they're fairly easy to figure out. They're all somewhat similar. In the olden days, when Wendy Hall and I were beginning, it was quite appropriate to write to an editor to say, I am doing a manuscript on this, would you be interested in having it? Most of the time nowadays, that's not appropriate. There might be rare exceptions where you genuinely have a reason to not quite know whether something would be suitable because of something they've said in the aims and scope or something like that. But most of the time, it's not going to give you much insight to or kudos or encouragement to communicate with the editor, to say, I'm writing a manuscript on this, would you like to have it? And the answer is always, it depends. If it's well written, if it's oriented to the right audience. So only when there's a very specific reason that requires clarity and that they can answer a question. But will you like my paper is not a question that they can answer in advance. Following the instructions carefully, there's all kinds of little things in those systems that say, put in a set of keywords, fill it in this way, leave your title in capitals, whatever. Follow them all meticulously. Review that package carefully. Sometimes those PDFs that get created have page breaks or glitches or some little error or something duplicated that you weren't aware of that was going to be included twice. So do make sure you read that carefully before you push that submit button. Then you've got a waiting time, and all journals try and make that waiting time move quickly, but don't be fooled by a journal that is going to tell you that it's going to give you a result in 10 days or 2 weeks, no matter what. That means that they've circumvented the review process. They probably don't have expert reviewers. That's a clue that that might be a journal that's using practices that are not consistent with the highest quality scholarship. And while there's a debate about the peer review system, it's not going to go away quickly. It is still the very best mechanism that people have to expose your work to people who have some expertise in the field, but they're human. They don't necessarily get it right. Your great work, they might misunderstand the idea. So there's still a human aspect to it, but it's not likely to go away quickly. Eventually, you will get something back. Well, you might get something back right away that says, no, actually, this is not really suitable for this journal, which is a sign that you maybe ought to have read more carefully the aims and scope. If you've written something, it's it's cardiology paper, and this is really about primary care, you'll often get a very early rejection. And you can get a rejection without review. An editor can make that decision that a paper is not likely to be successful in the peer review process because of the style or the content or the presentation or something like that. And you may just get it back quickly. Now that may seem insulting, but it also allows you to deal with it more quickly. Instead of waiting 3 or 4 months to hear the no answer, you may be able to figure out what might have gone wrong and take it somewhere else. But eventually you'll get that decision. Ideally, it'll come with some peer review information. Peer reviewers are experts chosen by the editor to have some potential for a valuable contribution. And some editors will take the comments that they make literally. In other words, they'll just take whatever the reviewers send and plunk it in an email, unedited and uninterpreted. And that can be kind of disconcerting because one might love it, one might hate it, and then what do you do? That's when it's okay to write back to the editor and get some advice. Or you may find the editor in the text of the letter has made it clear to you. The letter might say something like, we see some promise in this paper, but it's certainly not ready for publication yet. However, if you're interested in doing a revision, here's some reviewer letters, and these are the issues that they've raised. Sometimes an editor will indicate to you, reviewer number 1, as you'll notice, really thinks you ought to think you ought to go back to the drawing board and do another study. And that may not be necessary. However, there's some interesting ideas that reviewer's included. Reviewer number 2 has got some viable alternatives that you consider in this next revision. So that's really helpful if an editor has kind of guided you through how to make sense of that. But the editors may not be entirely in alignment, and there are times when they can vary. But the editor will make some kind of decision, and the choices are accept, minor revision, major, and reject. Minor usually means they're heading toward accepting it for publication, assuming that you can take up the guidance that they've given and incorporate it into a revised version. They're looking favorably toward it. Major revision may well be that they're interested in accepting it, but the level of revision that you need to do for that next round is a little bit more substantial, and it will presumably have to go out again for external review. Could go to those same reviewers, so if you don't like what one of them said, don't say nasty things back and say, reviewer number 1 was definitely an idiot, just be aware that it might go back to reviewer number 1. But with any luck, you'll have some guidance, and then you may just get a reject. So that means, doesn't mean you can't ever send another paper to that journal, but it's meaning not that paper, even if you revise it, send it back. And then you read between the lines, because often editors will try and give you some guidance as to how to the good news is to get a revise and submit. It's not very common at all to get accepted with no changes whatsoever. You know, maybe a few times in a lifetime that happens, but it's pretty rare. Certainly it almost never happens. In fact, I don't think it's ever happened in my journal. There's always something, because editors pay, or the reviewers pay a lot of attention, and there's some very good suggestions, sometimes just subtle fine-tuning. But when you have the option to revise and resubmit, do pay attention to what they're saying, because if they're saying what you need to do is something totally different than what you wanted to do or are capable of doing, then you might as well just say, forget it, I'm actually going to rethink this, and maybe I'll submit the same paper somewhere else that's going to be more friendly toward it, or I'll take some of that advice, the stuff that I can take, and I'm going to incorporate it into a revision and send it elsewhere. So even the worst critical feedback can sometimes be informative to you and be helpful in that next revision process. And even though we're usually mad when we get rejection and negative reviews, any of us who do it, most of the time you'll admit if you actually stop, take a deep breath, take a day or two to think about it, reflect on it, probably there's something that's a useful insight. And most likely, if you do revise on the basis of those insights, you create a better paper. Some of us have, some of our best papers have been rejected more than once, and that's actually probably what headed them toward being better and better. The angrier you get about trying to get that idea across. And often you're asked to provide some comments back. A cover letter that explains how you responded. This is a time when you don't say negative things about the reviewers. Be aware that they may see the comments, they may be aware of what you said. Thank them for the comments, and particularly highlight those aspects of the comments that may have been very helpful to you in creating insights about how you came across or what needed to happen. And if that's genuine, that can speak quite loudly to an editor. In other words, they got it, they interpreted it thoughtfully. I see how they've tried to do that. And where you have that kind of engagement, where you're demonstrating a scholarly engagement with the ideas, editors are likely to be more helpful to you in the next round. And thicken your skin. I put this example in because it's just a fabulous example of a nasty, nasty review. But you'll be able to look at it, making very nice comments, but short chapters are further divided into microsections, which can have the feeling of disjointed musings. This book is fit for a resting spot in the bathroom, but is no less profound for it. Delightful, elegant, artistic, slamming your work. So it's a wonderful example that I found in Maclean's from a book review. But sometimes reviewers are demonstrating, they're kind of being smartasses, demonstrating their cleverness at your expense. And it can bite. So just be aware that they are all human, and develop a thick skin. You don't want to hide away. If you get particularly nasty and reviews that say this is complete nonsense, this person doesn't know what they're writing. I mean, you get that kind of feeling from a review because you don't know who they are and they don't know who you are. And occasionally there's something negative. As editor, I usually try and modify that. I'll actually take out some mean things if I don't think they're helpful, particularly where I think it's less experienced authors. But you may be subject to them. And just develop that thick skin. If they're really nasty and really bad, then share them with a friend and have a good laugh. Nothing like diffusing it. One of my very best ones years ago when I got a review that said my argument had no epistemological integrity. I mean, for a faculty member, that's like, there's no worse thing you can say, that there's no epistemological integrity. But the very best part of it was it then said, we encourage this person to go and read, and it listed 2 Thorne papers. So that was fabulous. And I mean, that was just a gift. Everybody would love that. But I've used that to share sometimes with people, to say they can say really nasty things about you, but sometimes they don't know what they're talking about. So develop a thick skin. Have a sense of humor, share it with friends, but don't miss the opportunity, because there might be some wisdom. Even in the flippant and difficult comments, there might be some wisdom that can be helpful. The final slide here is some further useful resources. If you're thinking about writing, there's all kinds of really good articles that help you think about your writing, help you think about how to strengthen that and develop it over time. And because it is such an important part of certainly the career of those who are wanting to be involved in research and in academic life, it's useful to not just stay where you are, but continue to try and develop yourself in writing. It's a wonderful, wonderful way to express ideas. It's a wonderful way to engage with people all over the world. We're not writing just for our own local community. We're writing and communicating across the world. And in my career, I mean, we didn't have email when we were starting in our academic careers, but we've evolved to a place now where people are in touch with each other in a nanosecond. You publish something, it comes on early view within a few days. People see it, they communicate with you, want copies of it, raise questions. It's on ResearchGate. People are sharing ideas in relation to the published work in a way that's just unprecedented and exciting. And it creates for the world of nursing that capacity to be able to think collectively in a way that we couldn't before. You don't just have an idea and sort of 3 years later somebody picks it up in a library. The ideas are living and engaged and part of a worldwide conversation that we have that's absolutely exciting. And it's very fun to get involved in it. Just remember that everything you do publish becomes part of what's attached to you. You can't get rid of it. You can't shed that skin and say, I wish I never published that. You can certainly evolve and grow. That's absolutely expected. But if you happen to get something that is not your best work published, because you put it in a journal that'll accept just about anything, or you sent it too quickly, you got to live with that. So do pay attention to being your best at whatever you can be at whatever career stage. And for those of you who are part of an academic community like this, you've got faculty members around and they'll be clear and honest with you. It's not ready for prime time yet. Let's work on it a little bit more. Almost there, or yes, you are ready. I know you're hesitant and you know that there's many more ideas that you could have. We're all aware of how much more knowledge there is than we have, but they'll encourage you and say, no, it's time, send it out. Test the water, see what the reviewers think. So you've got having a community of people who will help you figure out when's the right time and how to go about that can make a huge difference in getting you into that publishing world. And I have to tell you, for those of you who haven't published, it's kind of addictive. Once you realize that conversation that you're in and the fact that you're actually able to make a contribution to the knowledge of nurses, you're able to have conversations with nurses you might never meet in person. You're able to be part of their conversation in their own coffee rooms and the ideas that they have for their own scholarship. That's a really, really powerful way to make a difference. So that's my basic overview on the art and science of getting yourself published. And I'd love to hear if there's any questions and comments.